Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today Emily Ye, Professor of Geography at CU Boulder. Emily earned her PhD at UC Berkeley, and her main research interests are on questions of power, political economy, and cultural politics in the nature-society relationship. Her regional expertise is in China, Tibet, and the Himalayas. As you know, Emily is the immediate past president of the AAG, and I consider myself fortunate to have been able to work with and learn from her during my tenure as vice president and even now as president. Emily is one of the presidents who led us through the difficult time when all of our activities were virtual. She was and remains closely involved in one of the pandemic rapid response projects that the AAG Council implemented, an initiative to bridge the digital divide by providing funding for Wi-Fi hotspots, Chromebooks, and laptops for underserved students in geography classes at tribal colleges and universities and historically Black colleges and universities. It's extra wonderful that she is able to speak with us all in person this year. As president, Emily chose climate justice as her theme. This theme infused her monthly columns, her plenary last year, and the work that she has led at the AAG. And here I refer to her co-leadership of the AAG Climate Action Task Force. As I read the abstract of Emily's presentation, I can see woven through it her interest in questions of power, in political economy, and in cultural politics in the nature-society relationship. I can also see her interest in climate justice. I look forward to hearing her address today on the very timely and interesting topic, Global Geographies of Weather Modification in an Era of Climate Change. Before she does that, she has another important task.
So thank you, Marilyn. And it's been an immense pleasure to work with Marilyn as well. So it is my distinct honor to begin by recognizing the two recipients of the 2023 American Association of Geographers Presidential Achievement Award. This award recognizes individuals who have made long-standing and very distinguished contributions to the discipline of geography. It's one of the highest honors a geographer can receive from our association, and it's really a privilege to be able to present this award, thus, to two scholars who have been transformative leaders in our discipline, Professors Gillian Hart and Matthew Turner. So I'm going to read testimonials that explain why the AAG is bestowing this honor upon them. First, Professor Emerita of Geography and Professor in the Graduate School at UC Berkeley, Dr. Gillian Hart is being recognized for her foundational work in the critical human geography of development, agrarian political economy, and post-colonial Marxism, and so much more. Dr. Hart has inspired a generation of geographers with her theorizations of relational comparison, conjunctural analysis, and critical ethnography as powerful methodologies for interrogating contemporary social relations. After her earlier research on agrarian Southeast Asia, including groundbreaking contributions to feminist debates about gender in the household, Dr. Hart turned her scholarly focus to post-apartheid South Africa. Her seminal book, Disabling Globalization, critiqued discourses of globalization through attention to multiple social spatial trajectories, while her subsequent book, Rethinking the South African Crisis, shed light on nationalism and the proliferation of populist politics, focusing on local governments as key sites of contradiction. Professor Hart has been a leading figure in demonstrating and interpreting Antonio Gramsci's contemporary salience and in offering geographical explications of the contemporary global politics of resurgent nationalisms and authoritarian neoliberalism. At UC Berkeley, she chaired the Center for African Studies for 5 years, co-chaired the Development Studies major for 2 decades, and has served on 85 graduate committees. She was an honorary professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and since 2016 has been Distinguished Professor at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. She was awarded the Vega Medal by the Swedish Society for Anthropology and Geography in 2018. So congratulations. We have two things. And a certificate. Thank you. Vilas Distinguished Professor of Geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Professor Matthew Turner is being recognized for his extensive and profoundly interdisciplinary contributions to nature society geography, particularly of arid and semi-arid regions of West Africa. His research blends a deep understanding of place and cultural practices with expertise in biophysical geography and geospatial analysis. Bringing long-term ethnographic fieldwork together with household surveys, GIS, remote sensing, and soil analysis, Professor Turner has made substantial contributions to political ecology, development geography, common property theory, the ecology of tropical savanna vegetation, and rangeland ecology. Moreover, through the integration of rigorous social theoretical engagement with mixed social science and ecological methods, Dr. Turner has fundamentally challenged dominant narratives surrounding environmental science and resource management in the Sahel and across semi-arid ecosystems more broadly. His scholarly interventions also include bringing political ecology together with science and technology studies and advancing geographical knowledge about pastoralism, gendered dimensions of food insecurity, and climate change and conflict. Dr. Turner has served as department chair as well as director of the University of Wisconsin Land Tenure Center. Known as an extraordinarily generous mentor to students and junior faculty alike, he has advised 26 PhD students, 43 graduate students overall, and served on roughly 150 additional graduate committees. Congratulations. Okay, now I want to start the second part here by welcoming all of you here in the room, thanking you for giving up your lunch hour to be here, welcoming also people who are online, and I want to give a special shout out to the people who are at the nodes, the experimental nodes of this year's AAG conference. So that is Geographers in Montreal, at Cal State Fullerton, and at UNC Chapel Hill. So over the past 3 years, I've worked with the AAG Climate Action Task Force to brainstorm ways of making our annual meeting more accessible and less carbon intensive. Now, efforts to change our annual meeting model run into, as you can imagine, many obstacles, financial and otherwise. So I'm very grateful and want to thank Executive Director Gary Langham, the AAG Council, and the staff for being willing to allocate significant funds as well as labor to experiment with new ways of doing things. And those new ways are really, I think, necessitated by our professional responsibility about climate change, as well as barriers to travel and challenges of access, which range from decreased funding for travel, for conferences, to visa restrictions, care duty, disability, among others. So this year's experiment include not only the 3 nodes I just mentioned, but also we beamed in some content from the nodes yesterday, where more than 15% of the sessions are fully hybrid, and more than 50% of the sessions are being live streamed out, and many of those are being recorded as well. So as a reminder, if you, like me, find that you can't go see everything you want to during the AAG, because everything you want to see happens at the same time, you can go back and see them later for several months, and that's one of the many, I think, gifts of this. These new ways of doing things are challenging, but also crucial for the future. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the topic for today. So knowing I had to give this talk, I was searching for something that might be of some interest to the broad spectrum of our discipline. And I came upon the weather because everyone is, it's something everyone can relate to somehow, right? So I'm going to talk about the weather today, but more specifically, I'm going to talk about human attempts to modify the weather through cloud seeding. And I argue that the salience of cloud seeding is twofold. One, as the impacts of climate change on water availability grow dramatically, the practice of cloud seeding to induce precipitation and otherwise modify the weather as a form of climate adaptation is on the rise around the world. So for example, provinces along the Yangtze River in China last summer engaged in very intensive cloud seeding in response to unprecedented drought. At the same time, the governance of weather modification has also been considered a proxy for solar radiation management, or SRM, specifically stratospheric aerosol injection, which is a highly controversial form of geoengineering. Even though their mechanisms are actually quite distinct, they're often analogized. For example, a recent Pew Research Center survey labeled both SRM and cloud seeding as forms of geoengineering. Others have argued that positive state narratives about cloud seeding within China could lead to broad public acceptance for solar radiation management there. So as I began to learn more about this, I became surprised both by how common cloud seeding actually is, including here in the US West, where we are and where I live, but also by the fact that with a few exceptions, it's been largely ignored in the recent geographical literature, in contrast to geoengineering, which has a large growing body of scholarship. So I want to argue that weather modification is precisely the type of complex phenomenon that geography's holistic interdisciplinary approach is particularly well suited to thinking about. So today I'm going to offer what I hope is a little bit of a fun overview of cloud seeding from a geographical perspective. And since most of the work really focuses on one country at a time, I'm going to also think about several places in relation to each other. First, some background. What do I mean by cloud seeding? So direct material attempts to intervene in the behavior of clouds began in earnest after the 1940s discovery by Vincent Schaefer, Bernard Vonnegut, novelist Kurt's older brother, together with the head of their lab at General Electric, Irving Lammeyer, that seeding supercooled clouds of water vapor in a lab with dry ice or silver iodide could cause water droplets to freeze and fall as snow. And this is because silver iodide has a similar crystalline structure to that of ice. So this is the mechanism of glaciogenic seeding, which is performed on winter orographic clouds, that is clouds that are formed when moist air is forced up over mountain ranges. And the seeding agent basically provides a nuclei for the formation of ice crystals, which then form snowflakes large enough to precipitate. The other main type is hygroscopic seeding, or the introduction of salt crystals into cumulus clouds to jumpstart and enhance collisions between small droplets, converting more of them into rainfall. So seeding can be done by aircraft or from the ground by burning flares of silver iodide so that an updraft can bring them into clouds, or by shooting silver iodide with cannons and small rocket launchers. The discovery of cloud seeding in the lab sparked both civilian and military efforts to deliberately modify the weather in the US and other countries. And this includes not just producing or preventing snow and rain, but also reducing hail, dispersing fog, and even efforts in the US in the 60s to seed hurricanes to reduce storm intensity. That didn't really work. In the US, federal funding for weather modification projects began in the early 1950s and increased over the next decades. However, the funding fell dramatically by 1980 due to the Reagan administration's cuts, the lack of a coordinating agency after NSF was displaced from its leadership role, and perhaps most importantly, insufficient proof that it worked. So the fundamental problem with cloud seeding, from the perspective of atmospheric science, is that there's no way to do a controlled experiment. Every cloud is different, and you have no way of knowing, what the cloud would have done had you not seeded it. And so many randomized experiments were conducted in the US from the 1960s to 80s, for example, and this resulted in lots of interesting things. There was one 2-decade-long dispute between a team at Colorado State University up the road here in Fort Collins who claimed that their experiments showed an increase in precipitation, and then a team at the University of Washington that reanalyzed the results and said that they were spurious. And like I said, this went on for 2 decades. One of the later published rebuttals states in part, quote, "If there were a movie version of the intriguing experiments, it should be patterned after Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon. Certainly everyone who studies this fascinating experiment sees something different." A fine statement, I think, on the situatedness of science as a social practice. Subsequent studies also pointed to flaws in earlier studies, and by 2003, the US National Research Council issued a report saying that there's still no convincing scientific proof of the efficacy of intentional weather modification. This and the end of federal funding led to publications with titles such as "The Rise and Fall of Weather Modification by Cloud Seeding." Nevertheless, cloud seeding as a management practice never stopped in the US. So all activities have to be reported to NOAA, which maintains an online record of these activities. But aside from that, there is no national regulatory framework in the US. Instead, projects are conducted by states and increasingly local governments and private interests, with utilities being the most common users of cloud seeding. But there are also companies that you can pay that will promise good weather on your wedding for a lot of money. Currently, 9 Western states have cloud seeding programs, including Colorado, and here's a website where you can go and apply for some funding to do this, and California, which is the most active. And in fact, some stream basins in the Sierra Nevadas have been seeded every winter for more than half a century. Severe drought in the US has sparked renewed interest in cloud seeding as a form of climate adaptation. For example, in 2018, the Colorado River Basin states entered into an interstate compact to allocate funding, $1.5 million each year for this activity. And this intensified interest has sparked new scientific interest in cloud seeding. And perhaps most interestingly, in 2020, there was an experiment, which is shown here, called SNOWY, which is a collaboration between Idaho Power, a private company, and NCAR, and as well as a number of university scientists, to actually use a physically based approach rather than a statistical one. And they actually demonstrated unambiguous evidence with radar of seeing where the precipitation lines, and they were able to trace the fall of a maximum of 275 acre feet, or about 135 Olympic-sized swimming pools per hour, over 24 minutes as a result of seeding. So weather modification has a long history in the US, China, Soviet Union, Australia, Israel, and Thailand. But with climate change, again, interest is really growing across the global south. So according to the World Meteorological Organization, there are now operational programs in more than 50 countries worldwide. Among others, these include programs in South Africa, Mexico, India, Iran, Indonesia, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. China has by far the world's largest cloud seeding program investment, but this is followed second by the United States. So one geographical concept which I suggest is productive for thinking about cloud seeding is the hydrosocial cycle, a term that captures the mutual constitution of water in society. In contrast to the pervasive and ever popular hydrological cycle that we all learn in school, and which has been increasingly critiqued as inadequate in the Anthropocene, the hydrosocial cycle is conceptualized as a social natural process by which water and society don't just pre-exist and relate to each other that way, but actually remake each other over space and time. So this framework shows us that water is always produced as particular water, both materially and discursively, and within specific moments, political and environmental contexts. So it compels us to ask questions which motivate, what I have to say here, such as, how is water conceptualized and produced, by whom and to what ends in specific political contexts? How has the construction and implementation of hydrological concepts shaped the politics of water circulation? How do capital and water shape the dynamics of water circulation? So from this perspective, we might say that cloud seeding conceptualizes or produces atmospheric moisture as pre-water, right? It intervenes technologically to convert it or more of it to its liquid form and tries to control where that liquid falls to the Earth's surface. Indeed, atmospheric scientists and weather modification practitioners routinely refer to clouds as, quote, extremely inefficient at generating precipitation. Thus, cloud seeding is a technological fix for increasing the efficiency with which water vapor, enframed as a potential resource, can realize its potential. As an operator at Idaho Power puts it, quote, "We can assist Mother Nature." Also telling is a review of cloud seeding experiments published in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society by a Boulder-based scientist. It's a very, very technical overview, but it begins with this statement, quote, "Water is one of the most basic commodities on Earth, sustaining human life. Despite the clearly fictitious nature of the commodity, to use Polanyi's term, and the extensive scholarly and political work done to reframe water as a fundamental right rather than commodity." Media studies scholar Yuriko Furuhata also suggests that the seemingly innocuous metaphor of, quote, "seeding clouds" suggests that, quote, "like the plants on the land, the clouds in the sky are seen as cultivable, as if the weather can be tended, fertilized, and harvested, like terrestrial vegetation." California's Weather Resources Management Act does not use the term weather modification for cloud seeding, but rather, quote, "weather resources management," making a resource not just of clouds, but of weather itself. So all of this suggests a particular epistemological understanding of atmospheric control and the importance of profit and capital in the US weather modification context. So in the US, the two most commonly expressed public concerns are about the risks of silver iodide in the environment and questions about stealing precipitation. So silver iodide is actually insoluble. And silver is, of course, toxic, but also found in small amounts in the environment. And so to date, studies of cloud seeding haven't found, and there have been quite a few, haven't found elevated levels of silver above background levels. Nevertheless, the few public controversies that erupt have continued to mostly focus on the risks of silver iodide. One proposed cloud seeding project by PG&E in Northern California in 2008 met with significant opposition from residents of Mount Shasta, who tried, ultimately unsuccessfully, to pass an ordinance asserting the need to establish, quote, "strict liability and burden of proof standards for chemical trespass." It also asserted the community's right to, quote, "natural water systems and cycles." And so I think there are two key limitations that, again, geographical scholarship points to this framing. First, addressing cloud seeding solely through the lens of risk frames it as a technical problem and really narrows the range of debate to a question of toxicity with all its attendant problems. And what it does is it really obscures, for example, other kinds of questions, such as whether, cloud seeding is a process of enclosure of the productive potential of the weather. Second, of course, it frames a particular kind of binary between a purportedly pristine nature and society. And indeed, opposition to cloud seeding that occurred even in the 1970s was often organized under the banner of, quote, "natural weather." There was one organization called Farmers and Ranchers for Natural Weather, for example. As several generations of geographers have argued, such a view of external nature doesn't stand up very well to critical scrutiny. And so it lends itself to arguments that through climate change, we're modifying the weather much more. And also, atmospheric scientists and weather modification practitioners saying things like, well, every time we fly an airplane through a cloud, we're actually unintentionally modifying the weather too, right? So my point is not that there shouldn't be opposition, but that this particular framing can be limited. And again, geography helps us see that. In terms of stealing clouds, atmospheric scientists say that the basic answer is no, and that's because, again, rain production where there are clouds, and you can't seed in a clear sky where there are no clouds, isn't limited by water availability, but rather by the conversion, right, to precipitation, hence the language of inefficiency. Some people do hedge their bets and say that extra area effects or extra local effects can be possible with large operations or on borders, but there it's not clear actually whether it's going to produce less or more precipitation, because in fact some of the silver iodide might not precipitate but rather be swept downwind where it can then precipitate further down. But so all of this uncertainty has significant effects on legal questions about atmospheric moisture conceptualized as a resource. In the US, three state cases have addressed liabilities and rights of weather modification, but these all happened in the 50s and 60s. So for example, Texas took the position that the landowner has a right to atmospheric water passing over the surface of the land. New York said that they don't have the right, and Pennsylvania said that they do have the right, but that if there's a state-permitted cloud seeding, then it deprives them of that right. And there's no federal case law that deals with interstate weather modification disputes. The impossibility of proving causation between a particular cloud seeding operation and the amount of a particular amount of precipitation that does or doesn't fall has really prevented further efforts to assign legal liability or to quantify any kind of right that might be asserted. Okay, and then one instructive and important player in cloud seeding in the US that I just want to mention is Idaho Power. This is not about Idaho Power, but it makes the same point. So Idaho Power owns and operates 17 hydroelectric plants, and it began cloud seeding in 2003. They claim that their operations have increased snowpack by an average of 12%. Scientists who work with them are really skeptical of this figure, again, because of the difficulty of quantification, given uncertainty. But the company argues that this is a 300% return on investment, equal to $9 million of water that otherwise would not have fallen. And this is one of many, many statements about the cost effectiveness and the cost-benefit analysis of cloud seeding, which you can see here too. And that's really one of the primary justifications of this in the US West. Idaho Power has also worked closely with NCAR in the Snowy project, and this is seen by participants as a truly excellent example of public-private partnership. Currently, the cloud seeding operations are funded a third by Idaho Power, a third by irrigators, and a third by the State Water Board. And in fact, they've worked with hydrologists to model who actually benefits from the additional snowpack with the aim of seeing if someone else should actually be paying more for it, right? So in the US's political economic context, cloud seeding arguably deepens capitalist relations, it produces public-private partnerships, it also ensures the viability of particular uses of water, in this case, again, hydropower production by dams, rather than focusing on other possibilities, such as conservation. Okay, so that was the US. Now I'm gonna shift to other countries, and to do that, we need to think for a moment about geopolitics. So if it hadn't been clear before, I think the volumetric nature of sovereignty, was brought to the fore by the early February appearance of the Chinese spy balloon. The US Department of Defense described its, quote, intrusion into American airspace as an unacceptable violation of US sovereignty. China, of course, argued that it was a, quote, civilian airship used for meteorological research, a weather balloon, in other words, which had strayed into American airspace due to the westerlies. What's notable for my purpose here is the use of the weather, both the invocation of the power of the winds as an agent and the purportedly purely technical nature of meteorological research to try to diffuse a claim of volumetric sovereign territory. In invoking this term, I'm of course building on arguments by political geographers that point to the flaws of common conceptualizations of territories as simply aerial and flat. Of course, we know that the proliferation of border walls, which are circumvented daily by tunnels and air travel alike, are testament to the problems of this two-dimensional view of territory. But as Stuart Eldon has argued, territory is much more adequately conceptualized as a volumetric political technology rather than a two-dimensional one. Now, of course, territorial disputes over subsurface have been, for example, long-standing, but again, new technologies, new geopolitical imperatives, and economic opportunities have opened up new attempts to territorialize aerial and subterranean spaces. And so weather, including its observation, its prediction, and its modification through cloud seeding, all enter into this struggle over volumetric state sovereignty. Now, in recent years, this has happened through concerns about the absence of rain. So, for example, in 2018, the Iranian Brigadier General Gholam Reza Jalali accused Israel and the UAE of stealing its rain, echoing similar remarks by former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2011. Similarly, after China announced its Sky River project, which I'll discuss in a little bit, as well as its new central level plan in 2020 that expanded the area covered by rain and snowfall modification to 5.5 million square kilometers, there were a flurry of Indian media reports accusing China of weaponizing the weather, with titles such as, China threatens India with a weather modification system that can cover 1.5 times the area of entire India. Scientific doubt about the possibility of stealing rain has not quelled such accusations, which rely on a view of clouds as atmospheric resources, but also frame the Earth's gaseous envelope within a state territorial logic of governance. Such accusations are also symptomatic, I argue, of the fact that both water infrastructure and weather prediction and forecasting are often used as vehicles of state territorialization. For example, with Turkey's hydraulic patronage of a water pipeline in northern Cyprus, or the Indian state's decision in 2020 to start broadcasting weather forecasts for Pakistan-controlled parts of Kashmir. Yet despite efforts to extend state sovereignty to new heights, the agency of weather as a non-human force also fundamentally limits such efforts to secure the volume. So one of the main targets of Iran's concerns, the United Arab Emirates, is also a growing player in weather modification globally. The UAE, of course, is notorious for its hyper-aridity and the fact that it has one of the highest per capita water consumption rates in the world. So in the UAE, settled agricultural production and the provision of free water and fuel were two key strategies of nation building in the early days after independence in 1971. Wealth from hydrocarbon exploitation has allowed the country to grow rapidly, from about 300,000 people then to about 10 million today. Profligate water use has, of course, resulted notoriously in rapidly falling groundwater tables and rising salinity. And so the UAE has embarked on desalination, which is a very extensive and expensive process. And this is funded by oil revenues, which makes energy integral to the hydrosocial cycle. Desalination also further increases the salinity of the sea, threatens marine ecosystems, and makes future desalination even more expensive. Nevertheless, through desalination, the state has fostered a sense of water abundance as a marker of modernity and wealth. Water parks, indoor ski slopes, golf courses, and other spectacles, such as Dubai's Miracle Garden, shown here, are all part of what Gökçe Gönül has called the infinity of water. That is an imaginary of the indefinite ability to keep expanding the production of water that helps reinforce state legitimacy and power. So while desalination is still the dominant component of this infinity of water, the UAE also began cloud seeding in 1990 in its efforts facilitated by a cooperation with NASA, with NCAR, and with Witwatersrand University in South Africa. So there, it's carried out by a few ground generators in a mountainous area, as well as by plane. And so according to one report, there are 9 pilots who are on 24-hour standby, ready to be airborne within an hour to seed clouds anytime an appropriate one appears in the sky. In 2022, more than 300 aircraft missions were flew, and proponents claim an ability to increase rainfall by 10 to 30%. The UAE also has a research program for rain enhancement science, which gives out $5 million in grants each year to scientists from around the world, including those from Japan, Germany, China, the UK, and the US, among others. And it holds also an annual International Rain Enhancement Forum, which is billed as a global platform that convenes leading international and national experts. And so a number of scientists from my university in Colorado also go there each year. As such, it's a well-funded demonstration of the UAE's achievement of constructing a knowledge-based economy, which is another very important national goal that this is integrated with. And I want to mention one last potential aspect of the UAE's rain enhancement program. So in 2016, that research program funded NCAR in Boulder to conduct a, quote, detailed modeling study evaluating the effects of building a mountain on the weather. The proposed scheme would entail building an artificial mountain somewhere near the coast in order to force air to rise and then create orographic clouds that would then allow for cloud seeding. In other words, the proposal is for terraforming on a geological scale, making a new landform with the aim of more efficiently squeezing water from the atmosphere and bringing it down to Earth. Here, the goal of weather modification really becomes what should rightly be called geoengineering. Okay, I want to turn lastly to China. So in China, the sheer scale and deep institutionalization of weather modification really distinguishes it from other countries, as does the extent to which the state is involved in ideologically legitimating it as a practice that's both effective and beneficial for a wide range of purposes. In the year 2000, a law was passed requiring the China Meteorological Administration to organize, coordinate, and guide weather modification activities. All provincial level governments have established bureaus with budgets to control the weather. And in 2007, offices were set up down to the city or district level. Almost 50,000 people are employed in cloud seeding at the provincial level. And as of 2015, there were reportedly more than 6,000 anti-aircraft guns, more than 7,000 rocket launchers, 400 ground combustion furnaces, and 44 aircraft used for cloud seeding. So weather modification in China is commonly deployed for 4 distinct reasons: to increase agricultural production, to secure water resources, and those two are, of course, familiar in many contexts. Third, notoriously, of course, to secure good weather for important political, economic, and cultural events, such as the opening ceremony of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And Soviet Union does this, or former Soviet Union does this as well, Russia. And lastly, for what is variously referred to as, quote, ecological construction, or safeguarding ecological security and helping to achieve, quote, ecological civilization. So in the Sanjiangyuan, or source of the Three Rivers area of Qinghai province, which is commonly referred to as China's water tower, and an area deemed crucial to the country's ecological security, the state claims that rain enhancement since 2006 has greatly increased the area of two lakes at the headwaters of the Yellow River. Now, I would note as an aside that expansion of lakes is a well-known impact of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau, so there's lots of reasons to be skeptical of this, but it's very much linked in the official discourse. And there are many associations made between cloud seeding and ecological civilization, a phrase that entered into political discourse in 2007, has subsequently been enshrined in the Chinese Communist Party Constitution and the PRC Constitution. Under Xi Jinping, it has been discursively coupled with the Chinese dream, and officials now refer to it as Xi Jinping's ecological civilization. As a socio-technical imaginary, ecological civilization really draws selectively on quite reductionist interpretations of China's traditional philosophies to assert cultural and national continuity while distinguishing China's path from that of the West. At the same time, it continues to maintain a long-standing focus on technological solutions to ecological crises, leaving economic growth unquestioned. So this mechanistic and techno-optimist understanding of the biophysical world plays an important role in accounting for the scale of China's cloud seeding operations relative to other countries. So for example, local officials have referred to clouds as, quote, airborne water reservoirs. Beyond this, however, there are also, I argue, other mundane political economic reasons for the extent of cloud seeding, including the need for local governments in today's decentralized fiscal system to chase project funding in order to continue to be able to pay their employees. And so this cartoon is by an anonymous Tibetan artist, but it depicts this wind of project and of course people chasing it, trying to gather the money from it. There's also employment, right? I mentioned earlier at the provincial level alone, 50,000 people are employed in this. So in contrast to the US, official reports about cloud seeding in China never mention cost-benefit analysis or cost effectiveness, right? It's a very different kind of set of logics at work. So one thing that political ecology teaches us, of course, is that changes to the hydrosocial cycle are never neutral. The organization of the flow and transformation of water really discloses the distribution of social power. Although there is widespread mainstream acceptance and approval of cloud seeding in China, given the way it's framed as a beneficial public service, marginalized residents of the Tibetan Plateau often experience it as a form of environmental injustice. So in one Tibetan pastoral village in northern Sichuan province, which is depicted in these photos, villagers blame weather modification practices of a nearby gold mine across the provincial border for inadequate rain during the 5th Tibetan month, and thus the expansion of sand dunes and grassland degradation. The county gold mine began cloud seeding in 1998 with ground-based artillery to induce rain before it falls on the mine. As one villager explained, quote, we don't know about what exactly is going on at the mining site because it's off limits to outsiders. Whenever dark clouds appear in the sky, we hear loud shooting noises from the mining site, and later we find the remnants of what they used to shoot in the sky in our grasslands. So here's a photo of one such rocket with the parachute still attached, which has landed. And so, the villagers are terrorized by the loud shooting noises, by these rockets that randomly fall from the sky, and angered by disruption to precipitation patterns. As a result, they filed grievances with the county government for 4 years before finally receiving minimal compensation, but no cessation of the activities. And there are many such cases. In another area in western Qinghai, pastoralists are similarly troubled by weather modification practices, and in some cases, villagers believe that Chinese construction companies or workers shoot artillery into the clouds to prevent rain that they need, and to counter this, they invite monks sometimes to hold rituals to invite more rain. So this last vignette hints at a significant blind spot in the critical literature on cloud seeding in other disciplines. Yuriko Furuhata, for example, makes a typical but problematic temporal claim. Quote, in many parts of Asia, rain-making rituals and the philosophy of 5 elemental phases once explained meteorological wonders. Today, however, she states, quote, the modification of weather by seeding clouds has supplanted ritualized forms of rainmaking. Historian James Fleming, too, who has written a book about weather modification, recalls Greek myths, but relegates rituals firmly to the pre-modern past. Postcolonial scholarship, however, would quickly note that such accounts relegate contemporary peoples, particularly those who might be considered indigenous, regardless of whether indigeneity is an articulated political category, to what Dipesh Chakrabarty has called the imaginary waiting room of history for the colonized and, quote, not yet modern. In Mangra County, Qinghai province in the Tibetan Plateau, which is shown here, the area in the red circle is a former military horse raising ranch that is now a state-owned company that produces barley, rapeseed, and other crops. The yellow circles show 2 summer pastures where local Tibetan herders spend their summer months, and the area in the blue is the only Tibetan community in the region that has continued to transmit tantric practices around protecting crops from hail. Tibetan villagers in the yellow say that in the summer and fall, the state farm shoots at the clouds to protect their crops, but that this creates flooding in other areas. Tantric practitioners in the area, labeled in blue, in turn seek to repel the rain through rituals, leading the yellow areas, they say, to suffer between these two. And there are many such cases. So rather than relegate those who engage in ritual actions of hail protection to the pre-modern past and thus deny them a coeval existence, again, I think geographical literature has argued that it's more ontologically just to understand both the shooting of silver iodide, which after all is pretty, pretty shaky too, with artillery, and the performance of rituals as different worlding practices, right, or different enactments of emergent heterogeneous assemblages of humans and non-humans, which are not cordoned off from each other, but rather asymmetrically connected within uneven fields of power relations. Okay, turning to my last case. And this considers a very different set of worlding practices and epistemologies. This is how it's supposed to work here in this cartoon. And this is the project that is called the Sky River Project on the Tibetan Plateau. This project was launched in 2016 with a promise to radically scale up weather modification by intercepting water vapor, supposedly, from the Indian monsoon over the southern plateau, channeling it all the way to the parched Yellow River Basin in northern China, where it would then purportedly fall on as rain over a vast area, increasing water supply by 5 to 10 billion cubic meters annually. Government reports call it an aerial corridor of the South-North Water Transfer Project, asserting an equivalency between ground and air transport of water. As such, I argue it went beyond the conceptualization of cloud as resource to a vision of turning the atmosphere itself into a form of infrastructure, a corridor that allows the transport of water across great distances. So this project was undergirded by several academic papers that introduced the term Sky River, led by Professor Wang, then president of Qinghai University, and then an academician, I can never say that word, of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So their initial paper was quickly followed by the establishment of the Sky River Project, which was described as involving a network of, quote, tens of thousands of cloud seeding chambers on the Tibetan Plateau that would burn silver iodide, which would then be swept into the Sky River, and a network of new satellites that would monitor the monsoon and gather real-time atmospheric data, which would then be connected to the remotely ignited burners to send precipitation northwards. The project was featured as, and these are some of these burners that are referenced, was featured in Qinghai Province's 13th five-year plan, designated as a national key research project and a project of international significance. There were tests conducted in 15 ground operations such as these. A researcher was quoted as saying they were very promising, but in late November 2018, the project attracted significant online criticism, with one Chinese scientist writing, quote, "This is an absurd fantasy project with neither scientific basis nor technical feasibility." Another argued, "It is beyond the capability of human beings to make rain fall in the Yellow River Basin instead of the Yangtze River Basin." In late 2018, investigative journalists visited the Tsinghua University lab responsible for the project, but were not allowed to enter. And when they interviewed the rocket technology company responsible for the burners, they were told, "The leaders think this project is not convenient to talk about right now." Since the end of 2018, there have been no new official pronouncements regarding Sky River's promises and achievements. Now, according to one scientist familiar with the project, as of 2022, the team is still continuing its research on Sky River, but in a greatly scaled back way and shielded from the public eye. Now, even though the project itself was thus greatly exaggerated in its promise, I argue, again based on this literature on the hydrosocial cycle, that it's worth examining the concepts that justified its existence. The papers assert a distinction between the well-known concept of atmospheric rivers, and people in California are very familiar with this now, and the Sky River. This distinction was widely panned by atmospheric scientists as simply a ploy to gain funding through novelty. But I argue there was more than that. In addition to garnering funding, the goal is written in these papers. It says that the goal of asserting it as a distinct concept is to, again, affirm an equivalency between the atmosphere and the ground to apply the same kinds of techniques of optimization used terrestrially. The original paper in Chinese describes the significance of the Sky River in terms of national economic development, ecological civilization construction, national security, and geopolitics. It argues that traditional water management techniques have reached their limit, and thus that the, quote, materialization of cloud water resources is a process of opening a new source to counter the throttling of surface water resources. They further argue, if a new interbasin water transfer model is developed, there's hope to solve the problem of the arid climate. Spatial water transfer can be conducted between the Yellow and Yangtze River basins, which would ameliorate North China's serious shortage of water resources. And in another paper, they argue that atmospheric water resources should be coupled with conventional surface water resources in a, quote, new water resource configuration infrastructure. Here's another artistic visualization. So in other words, Sky River as a scientific concept was formulated explicitly in the words of its authors to develop a, quote, new vision of the water cycle. And they proposed to do this through the application of terrestrial hydrological concepts to atmospheric moisture, forgetting that atmospheric moisture is not, in fact, always convertible to the former through technology. Also, why it still matters is that stories about Sky River continue to circulate on Chinese social media, often in nationalist terms. One blogger who reported in 2021 on the suspension of the project noted that it could take 50 years to realize the project, but argued, quote, if we do not do research on this project, it will not happen in China, but rather will be realized in a foreign country. Another video by a microblogger states that once the project is complete, quote, those foreign experts who made those irresponsible remarks, that is, who called this into question, will eat their words and solicit support from viewers by asking, quote, if you think our country's infrastructure construction is awesome, please cheer them on in the comments, thus equating atmospheric water transport with infrastructural construction. Thus, the ideological promise of Sky River to optimize the distribution of water through the atmosphere conceived as an infrastructure to guarantee China's ecological security lives on. So to conclude, in December 2022, a startup called Make Sunsets made headlines when it claimed to have launched a weather balloon from Mexico that released sulfur particles into the stratosphere without public engagement or scientific scrutiny, and they even attempt to sell these credits for future flights. Now, most observers dismissed it as a terrible publicity stunt designed to stir up controversy, but ultimately to push SRM. Now, of course, the injection of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to reflect incoming solar radiation is not the same as injecting silver iodide into the troposphere. It's common to classify the former as geoengineering and the latter not. The difference in scale is crucial, but the two are not unrelated. Moreover, cloud seeding is, in fact, the mechanism behind at least one type of SRM, and that is marine cloud brightening, where you seed marine clouds with salt particles to increase the brightness and longevity of cloud cover to reduce temperatures, and that has actually gone beyond the lab to outdoor experimentation approved over the Great Barrier Reef. So geographers have conceptualized geoengineering as a spatiotemporal fix to the second contradiction of capitalism. They've explored why it's incompatible with liberal democratic politics. They've discussed the importance of geopolitics. And yet, despite the growing richness of this work, there's been little consideration for precedents and parallels from weather modification. But we can see that both, for example, rely on a machinic metaphor for the atmosphere. As one early article on weather modification explained it, quote, from the 1950s, think of the cloud as the inverted well shaft and pumping equipment. Even more than cloud seeding, the vision of Sky River is a mechanistic and techno-optimist vision of the atmosphere as a set of relations that can be modeled, modified, and optimized for human use. In addition, both appear to be promissory technologies, those that promise to be transformative in the future, but are often subject to overpromising in terms of their potential and yet have other effects. So the approach I've taken today is, with weather modification, is to understand or try to begin to talk about how the promise of weather modification has been taken up in different economic, political, and cultural contexts. So on the one hand, we see that cloud seeding has become a platform for transnational scientific collaboration, for example, allowing funding and technical expertise to flow between the US, UAE, and China. Cloud seeding everywhere intervenes into the hydrosocial cycles and frames the atmospheric moisture as resource, subject to volumetric sovereignty, creating new possibilities of conflict, whether over property or territory. On the other hand, the particular hydrosocial interventions differ considerably, with a focus on cost-benefit analysis and public-private partnerships in the US context, to bolstering state legitimacy through an imagination of the infinity of water and becoming a regional powerhouse of scientific expertise in the UAE, to the infrastructuralization of the atmosphere and the perpetuation of a large-scale bureaucracy in China. The geopolitical tensions exacerbated by cloud seeding, the lack of a robust regulatory framework, or more importantly, even anyone's good idea for how to begin to construct one, and the examples of injustice, even in the case of very localized weather modification, deserve more geographical research, especially as large-scale planetary modifications continue to be considered. Thank you so much for listening. So I will, you all should go to the next session or go have lunch, but I would love to talk individually to anyone who has any questions. Thanks.